Have you ever been sitting in a round, listening to an opponent's speech, thinking of responses to their arguments, and trying to gauge the judge's reaction when, all of a sudden, you're jolted back to reality by the words, "And my opponent dropped all 3 of the responses I gave to their second contention." And your first thoughts are, wait, she had 3 responses to my second contention? If this sounds familiar, then this video is the solution. My name is Olivia. I'm a staff member at Triumph Debate, where we've coached students to stage at a state and national level. And one thing each of those students had in common was a strong understanding of how to flow, which is what we're going to teach you about today. If you enjoy this lesson and want to experience more like it live and with our staff, consider registering for our Triumph Debate Winter Intensive. Our intensive is ideal for any Lincoln Douglas debater looking to improve over winter break, or prepare for the January-February NSDA LD topic. Work one-on-one with Triumph's national champions and coaches to prepare for the Jan-Feb topic, and master the skills you need to succeed. Reserve your spot and register today at the link down in the description below. The first thing you need to know is, what is flowing? Flowing is just a specific form of note-taking for debaters. It's writing down what you and your opponents say in each speech to keep track of all the arguments made in the round. Now that you know what flowing is, you're probably wondering, why does accurate flowing matter? There are a few reasons. First, and most importantly, it ensures that you, as the debater, are covering and responding to all arguments in round. The example I gave in the beginning of today's video is funny, but also accurate for a lot of debaters who struggle to keep up with everything that goes on in a round. You should flow so you don't drop or concede any arguments in a round. Another reason why you should want to flow is because it allows you to be more organized in round, manage your time better, and helps you build a more complete picture of how the arguments in round are interacting. Finally, flowing well is important to your ability to win other rounds. If you can reference back in detail and with good clarity to the notes from your second round last Saturday, you can keep track of the arguments and pieces of evidence used. This allows you to prep more efficiently. You'll be able to find evidence a lot easier, prep out responses to your case, and block out other advocacies if you can keep track of all of these things. In short, flowing not only helps you in that individual round, but also for every round afterwards. So, now that we know what flowing is and why you should do it, what do you need to get started with flowing? That answer depends a lot on how you flow. There are 2 ways to flow: on paper or on your laptop. Flowing should look the same no matter how you flow. The only thing that changes is the process. If you plan to flow on paper, you'll need 2 things: pen and paper. Many debaters use multiple colors to flow different sides. For example, they may flow all AF arguments in red and all neg arguments in blue to help keep things organized and easy to read. Some debaters find that one color flowing works best for them, and they find it easier to keep columns neater. Many debaters also use specific pens, like Padlet G2s, to help them flow more smoothly. This is all up to personal preference. Additionally, you'll need paper. Like pens, there are also a couple of options: legal paper, which is longer, and letter paper, which is a normal paper size. This has more to do with how much you're writing down. For example, traditional LD debaters will almost always use normal-sized letter paper, while policy debaters will typically use the longer legal paper. We recommend asking your coach or captain for advice on what's best for you. Some debaters also use cardstock or legal pads. We at Triumph personally believe that blank white sheets of paper are best because it gives you the most space and is easy to read. Plus, you can print out our sample preflows, but ultimately, this too is up to personal preference. If you plan to flow on your laptop, you'll need 2 things: a laptop and a software to flow on. Most debaters use Excel, or a debate-specific software called Flexcel. We will link Flexcel in the description of this video. If you're interested in paperless flowing, we recommend speaking with your coach and or captain to discuss whether it's strategic for you in your event and circuit. Now that we have all of our materials ready, how do we set up the outline and structure of a flow? First, determine how many pages of paper or tabs in Excel that you need. This depends on your event and the style of debate that you do, such as traditional versus progressive Lincoln Douglas. Our recommendations are, for Lincoln Douglas, if you compete on a traditional circuit, we suggest using two pieces of paper, one for the AC with responses and defense, and the other for the NC with responses and defense. If you compete on the national circuit or do progressive debate, we recommend flowing each part of the case and all off case on separate sheets. For example, you may have 4 sheets of paper for the one AC, one for framing, one for each advantage, one for solvency, etc. For policy, we also recommend flowing each part of the case and all off case on separate sheets. For public forum, we recommend 2 sheets of paper, one for the pro case with responses and defense, and one for the con case with responses and defense. Next, determine how many columns you need on each page. This, like pages, depends on your event. Our recommendations are, for Lincoln Douglas, have one page where you have 5 columns for the 1 AC, 1 NR, 1 AR, 2 NR, and 2 AR. This will be where you flow the AC and responses to it. On the second page, have columns for the NC, 1 AR, 2 NR, 2 AR. This will be where you flow the NC and responses to it. If you compete on the circuit, have multiple pages with all of these columns ready for all arguments that could be introduced in the debate. So, for example, if the 1NC is a security K, econ disadvantage, topicality, and a process CP, then you would flow each of these on a separate sheet of negative paper. For policy debate, pages that you use to flow the 1AC contentions will have 7 columns for the 1AC, 1NC, 2AC, neg block, 1AR, 2NR, and 2AR. Pages that you use to flow the 1NC off case will have 6 columns for the 1NC, 2AC, neg block, 1AR, 2NR, and 2AR. Be sure to have multiple pages with all of these columns ready for all arguments that could be introduced in the debate. For public forum, have 2 pages, each with 3 columns. The first column should be case, second rebuttal, and third would be defense or front lines made either in rebuttal or summary, as well as any additional layers added in summary. The labels of each column really can be anything. We used what the purpose of each column here is to be clear, especially since labeling it by speech can be messy and different, depending on if your team speaks first or second. Find a system that works for you. Finally, be sure to have a column for final focus, especially if your team is speaking last. Some debaters also like writing their notes down for final focus on a separate sheet of paper. Finally, make the choice of horizontal or vertical. We recommend orienting your paper vertically because it maximizes the amount of space for arguments and information. Since new information is added by adding another line to the flow, combined with the use of shorthand or abbreviations, vertical space is a lot more valuable than horizontal space. Now that you know the structure of flowing, here's how you'll actually do it. The first thing to remember is that you should always actually flow what your opponent is saying. In many circuits, debaters will disclose their cases and give you access to their speech doc. Don't fall into the trap of flowing from speech docs. There's nothing more embarrassing than giving a rebuttal to an argument your opponent decided not to read, but that you had on your flow anyways because it was in their speech doc. Or you can miss an argument that your opponents made off the top of their head, or that they intentionally didn't send to you. Instead, we suggest using speech docs to review evidence or fill in holes, like if you missed a date. A good way to avoid this is by asking for marked docs if your opponent indicated changes during their speech. Be sure to clarify what was read and not read if you were confused. Next, have a set of priorities. Know the most important aspects of each speech that you should flow first. In general, you'll never be able to write everything your opponent is saying because you just can't write or even type as fast as they speak. This is especially important, however, if your opponent's rate of speed far exceeds your capacity to write. Sometimes you may have to make choices. Knowing what you want to prioritize is important to making sure that you never miss key aspects of the debate. We recommend prioritizing the argument analysis or tags, which is what their argument is actually saying, then their support, like evidence or examples, their impacts, evidence citations, and finally, contention taglines or subpoint taglines. Generally, most people will flow tag, author name, and date as the essential parts. Even if your priorities don't match ours, Just having an idea of what you need to capture most will help you immensely. Finally, to make it easier on yourself in round, be sure to write down your case in the relevant column on your flow before the debate. We call this preflowing. It saves you a ton of time in round and helps you stay organized. You can use the preflows Triumph Debate created. We'll link those in the description of this video. With all that being said, here's what flowing looks like. First, you should label your flow. This allows you to know what round the flow is from, at what tournament, and who your opponent was. All this combined helps you recount your flow a lot easier later on after the tournament. You can label it by your opponent or the tournament and round. Next, you'll start off actually flowing by writing definitions, observations, and framing. Not all debates will have all three, but these three aspects of a speech will generally go at the top of a flow. Now, the flow we have as a demonstration here is a Lincoln-Douglas traditional flow. If you compete in policy debate or progressive Lincoln-Douglas, this is where you'd move to a new sheet. As you can see, we've started out flowing our opponent's definition of ought, defined as a moral obligation. This is a fairly standard definition of ought, and so, having heard it before, I probably have a shorthand way of writing it down. This is one of our biggest tips. Use shorthand wherever and whenever you can. These are a few examples of really common but effective shorthand words. Your goal is to get the main idea of their argument or piece of evidence in as few words as possible. Avoid writing full sentences and abbreviate wherever possible. So, after definitions, my opponent moves on to reading their framework. They have a value of morality. To indicate what a value is, I'll write V. And then, because morality is an extremely common value, I'll just shorten it to M. Then, because morality is defined as the distinction between right and wrong, and that's a very common definition, we'll just write down right/wrong next to it to indicate that that's how my opponent decided to define morality. Let's say my opponent reads a card or a piece of evidence to justify their framework, like they did in this example. To indicate a card, I like to draw a little box. Then write the author's last name and date that the evidence was published. Then, underneath that, I'll use dashes for organization and the substance of the card. Each person has different symbols they like to use to indicate certain things. We have staff members who use slashes to indicate something as a piece of evidence, or an exclamation mark to denote an impact. The exact symbol system you use is entirely up to you and what your coach recommends, but having symbols to denote certain things is really important for organization and structure, as well as flowing quickly. We have provided you with some examples of commonly used symbols while flowing. In this example, my opponent reads the value criterion or standard of minimizing structural violence. So, I shorten this as much as possible. Then they state that they have two justifications for this. I'm going to make sure I number each justification to get the substance and any evidence written down. I'll use the same format I did before for the cards: box, last name, date, and try to shorten and abbreviate as much as possible. If, for some reason, your opponent doesn't read a date for their evidence, just get the last name and write down ND for no date. Alright, so let's move on to flowing contentions. First, you're going to want to continue abbreviating taglines and trying to save time writing things down. In this case, let's say that their contention 1 tagline is, "Nuclear weapons are structurally violent." You can shorten that significantly by just writing NW equals SV. In this case, my opponent uses a card, but even if they hadn't and was only making analytical arguments, I would still flow that analysis. As you're flowing, it's important to leave enough space between arguments to have enough room in your preceding columns to write down all of your responses as well. Contention 2 is pretty similar, this time using a bit more symbols. An arrow going up indicates an increase, a yield sign means something leads to something else, etc. You can also see I used exclamation points to indicate an impact. If you were to run out of room in a column on your flow, don't stop flowing. This didn't happen here, but if it had, I would have pulled out another sheet of paper and kept flowing. Keep extra sheets on you at all times in the event that this happens. You can typically predict if you're going to run out. For example, if you're flowing the AC and it's only been 4 minutes, but you're getting to the end of your paper, that's a good indicator that you should grab that extra piece of paper, because you'll need it soon. Now we've officially flowed their entire constructive. But we're not done yet. Next is writing down case responses. Let's say I'm going to agree with both of their definitions. As you can see, I drew an arrow across the entire flow, letting me know that there is no more debate on that issue. This is what we call extending. If I have multiple responses to the value of morality, I simply draw an arrow directly from that argument or card and several numbered responses on my flow. Keep in mind that I'm continuing to abbreviate and shorthand as much as possible to save time flowing. The important thing here is staying organized. To do that, I use arches and arrows. To group arguments together, I draw an arch and then an arrow. This lets me know I am responding to two arguments at once. If you're just responding to one argument, I use a single arrow to directly indicate what I am responding to on the flow. This allows me to know what attacks correspond to what arguments. I'll do the same formatting on the contention levels. If I want to introduce a card in my rebuttal, I'll use the same symbols and examples to do so. Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, that I run out of time and dropped my opponent's contention 2. I would draw an arrow indicating that their contention 2 extended across the flow because it was dropped, similar to how I agree with their definitions. So at this point, we've gone over the basics. Now all we have to do is apply them to another speech. We'll use arches to group arrows, to indicate responses, numbers to organize attacks, and repeat. Now that you know the basics of flowing, the best way to improve is through practice. We've created an activity you can use to practice your flowing techniques that will be linked in the description below. If you want to see more videos and lessons like this, let us know by liking this video, subscribing, and commenting below. Good luck, and we hope you found this helpful.